So thanks for listening, and I'll pass over to Katie.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. I have to say this is my first, at least in this forum, face-to-face conference for about 2 years. Apologies to all the delegates online that you can't be with us today. Let me say maybe something briefly about me first, for those of you that don't know who I am. I'm a senior researcher in the Centre for Sport and Society, as you know, and my work has revolved around identity, its links to sport, and what we can learn from this about human relations more widely. And that work has taken up several themes: gender, national identity, the sport ethic, and implications for health. And my own career as an elite athlete led me on this path because I experienced firsthand questions of inequality, inequity, the slowly changing status of women's sports, the ways in which this status impacted differently on male and female athletes, and many of the policy implications. So I've also sought to put this into practice. Just like Paul, I've got skin in the game as a volunteer coach, administrator, and a policy advisor. And one example of that was my work with the Ladies Gaelic Football Association, who now run an annual programme to develop the capacities of females in non-playing roles, and in particular, their use of evidence now to guide their strategy and planning. And I say that to illustrate the point that I think Paul has made, which is that it's important that our knowledge about sport is more certain, better fitting, and guided by evidence rather than by assumptions. And that's critical for us, I think, as a collective, because in sport, we're probably dealing with one of the most powerful transfer mechanisms for culture and social structure. So if sport can assist in the achievement of human rights, it's beholden on us then to understand whether and how this happens. And I think it's fair to say that the only major, I say, human rights victory that might be attributed to sport, at least in part, is that of the anti-apartheid movement. And there are many paradoxical practices when it comes to the rights of those involved in sport, including passivity and normalcy. Human rights are probably easier to endorse than they are to enforce. And one way to examine this is to look at the lived experiences of people and to generate more evidence of the circumstances under which being involved in sport might contribute to the struggle for human rights as athletes, spectators, in voluntary and paid roles. So let me say something then about where the research project I'm currently involved in, which is on online hate and online hate in football, fits in this context. So this is a multidisciplinary team of researchers from the UK and Ireland, comprised of experts in the social sciences, media studies, and computing sciences. And there's a growing body of literature which not only documents the variety and extent of hate speech on the internet, but also considers whether this cyber hate might be different to its offline equivalent. So beyond ease of access, size of audience, perceived anonymity, a distinctive feature of cyber hate generally is the instant nature of communication. And that means that online hate can be more spontaneous and therefore less considered. There's an obvious physical distance between users, which some researchers have suggested explains the absence of the usual cues of empathy and censure that tend to keep harmful, antisocial, or discriminatory behavior mostly in check. Someone who's committed to engaging in online hate may not be deterred offline, and they may even take pleasure in it. Another feature is that those who might or might not otherwise engage in offline hate are given pathways by the internet, one of which is a shared identity with other in-groups. So you can achieve mass communication with a very targeted delivery, spanning distance and over very short periods of time, sometimes literally seconds. Compared to offline modes of communication, the internet encourages forms of hate speech that are likely to be unfiltered, sometimes gut, viscerally targeted reactions, as in the case I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which was the abuse of 3 Black English male players who missed penalties at last year's Euros. Another example, closer to home here, was the messages sent to Ian Wright in 2020 by an 18-year-old Irishman who'd lost a FIFA game. Never aspire to be a Legends player in a computerized football game. These messages can be made against a person or group identified by their race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, sexual orientation, and other protected characteristics. Now, in saying all that, I don't mean to imply that online hate can't be coordinated and involve planned posts, especially from hate groups. But I do want to point out that the internet encourages forms of hate speech that are instantaneous because of the particular qualities of online communication. Now, what implications might this have for understanding the right to be free from harm or harassment, to be treated with dignity and respect? In our scoping review of the current literature, there's yet no firm evidence about the effects of being subjected to online hate in sport compared to offline, but it is growing. So let me say something about what we feel we do know so far from the current literature. And research in this area has been growing since about the mid-2000s. This isn't surprising, given the growth in the use of social media more generally, but what might surprise you is that only an initial 6 research publications were released between 2005 and 2014 that examined the topic specifically, rising to just over 40 by 2022. Much more is published on connected but wider topics like forms of abuse in sport. Message boards and fan fora were the focus of the early research before the shift to big social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook. So Twitter is the most popular data source for researchers so far. As you probably know, it facilitates direct communication between users, but from a research perspective, it also permits relatively easy access to data. And so far, that research has concentrated mainly on sports played in the UK and North America. In the last 5 years or so, a handful of studies have been published on other contexts: Italy, Iran, Mexico, Poland, and Russia, and Brazil as well. Now, this is partly because of the dominance of English language publications, so there is a lot of scope for more work, especially cross-comparative work. Football or soccer is the most popular sport worldwide, and unsurprisingly, it also dominates the research on online hate in sport. The mediascapes or images of sport created by social media are shown in this research to be just as important as the events themselves. Racism, probably again not surprisingly, has been the main focus, followed by misogyny, homophobia, and nationalism. And online hate perpetuated by fans against athletes and other marginalized groups was examined the most by researchers so far. What kind of issues have arisen? Issues of anonymity, the fostering of online environments, and the reliance on user-reported moderation have been raised. As one paper argued, some of the characteristics that make online spaces most attractive, such as freedom of expression, perceived or actual anonymity, reduction of inhibition and expression of thought, also make the environment difficult to regulate and police. But our review of the literature has also highlighted another important point, which is that one-dimensional solutions, like, for instance, simply removing anonymity, would be highly unlikely to succeed. In the research on online misogyny, for example, which is important in light of today's celebrations of women's achievements, there's a compelling argument for better rather than more legal regulation. Most of the research to date relies on secondary analysis of online hate. So only 4 of the 40-odd publications collected primary data, which was one of our motivations for the research design adopted in the research project. So the project is called Tackling Online Hate in Football, TOHIF, and the website is TOHIF.com. So let me finish then by describing that project a bit more. Last year, just under half of English professional players received abuse on Twitter. International tournaments like the Euros are particularly significant sites where identities are highlighted, debated, and reshaped by social media. And in this context, TOHIF has 3 stages of work. The first is to frame online hate by identifying the fault lines and the flashpoints through a deep mining of Twitter data. Second is to trace this in the form of its rhetoric and points of attack, starting in 2008, including men's and women's Euros, and finishing with the women's tournament this year. And third is to develop strategies to tackle this. We hope that the range of skill sets on the research team means that we can leverage important bridges between the latest computing science techniques, content analysis, qualitative insights from those who experience online hate directly, a critical analysis of the needs of stakeholders and activists in, for instance, race equality and social justice, and awareness also gleaned from those charged with addressing the issue, such as police, legal, and sports regulatory professionals. The mining of Twitter data is underway, as are some interviews. So I want to end my part now, in at least this part of the panel presentation, by emphasising that we do want to hear from and work with partners to develop workshops, policies, and machine learning procedures to identify and combat this online hate. There's much more to say on it. I'm sure you will have much more to say on it, especially the balance to be struck, I think, between rights and responsibilities. It's an issue that cross-cuts the achievement of human rights more generally. So I'll hand on to Dr. Paul Kitchen now, and I'll reserve any other comments for the Q&A to come.